Hello, everybody. Welcome. We seem to have some internet connection problems. So the internet seems to be dropping out. If that keeps happening, then it'll be a short satsang for today. But until that happens, we'll push on. I wanted to emphasize the notion of concepts and beliefs, because peace of mind So, the internet has dropped out several times in the last 10 minutes. So if that ends up being an ongoing thing, then I apologize, and today's satsang will have to be postponed to the next scheduled date. I'll restart. I'd like to speak about beliefs and concepts, because peace of mind really is quite dependent on there being an internal clarity in regards thoughts, in relation to thoughts and the content of thought. If our relationship to thought remains as is the default position, and what I mean by the default position is that as humans, there is a development process that takes place, as is obvious, physical and mental, intellectual. And as part of that developmental process, the sense of self gets put in place, and our relationship to thinking is part of that developmental process. And so the standard default relationship to thought is that there is a complete involvement in thought. And another way of saying that is there is a complete belief in thought, our own thoughts. So by default, there is a presupposition that says, if I thought it, it is true. So this actually is the value of satsang. It is pointing out things that we might not be aware of, and they're not complicated things necessarily. They can be very simple things. And if it occurs to us, if something that has never occurred to us before occurs to us, and we see it for ourselves, potentially short period of time, short period after the seeing. So I say this about satsang and insights and how change can happen because of that statement I just made, that our general relationship to thought is, if I think it, it is true. And the reality of thoughts are that they are subjective and relative. So subjective means at best accurate, from up on top view of a tank, a water tank, we can say the shape is a circle. From a different perspective, we would say, from a front view, we could say the shape is rectangular, or it's a square, depending on the shape of the height of the water tank, height relative to its width. So, which is correct, that it is rectangular or that it is circular? And they're both accurate from a is a relative piece of machinery. It's not an absolute. It can't produce absolute things. It seems like the connection is not holding up. So what I suggest is that instead of talking, I'll really such a problem. I might add some guided words in relation to just being. It was such a good connection the first time that I did the talk from this new location. And today, not so much. So I was saying that we need to have a good relationship or a clarity in relation to our thinking and the content of thought. thoughts being relative and subjective mean that they're not telling us the truth. They can sometimes be accurate. When it comes to suffering thinking, or suffering, which essentially is a narrative of thought, suffering is always misguided. That's one of the characteristics of suffering, and it's great for us to recognize that. Suffering is always misguided. Ironically, when suffering is there and there is full involvement in the suffering, there is the opposite relationship to suffering. This is telling me the truth about myself, about the past, about the future. It is describing what these outcomes mean about me and my life. And the reality is that suffering is ignorance, was based on ignorance. The ignorance is the opposite of understanding, we could say misunderstanding. And it's a misunderstanding on many different levels. At the very root, a misunderstanding about ultimately who and what we are at our core. And then built on that misunderstanding, which means a disconnection to who and what we are at our core. That's why there is a misunderstanding that gets put in place, because a connection to self has been covered over, and so the idea of self becomes ingrained as I am the body. And the more subtle aspects, which turn out to be the more real aspects of self, are there. They remain to be there. They remain there, but they are not able to be felt, or there's no awareness of that aspect of self. And so the conclusion is I am what I am aware of. And we are aware of the more gross aspects of the human being. So then our sense of self becomes ingrained as I am this body in this world. And when our sense of self is limited to form and body and world, it's all about outcomes. And so because there is a disconnection from self, there is an uncomfortableness, an inherent uncomfortableness. And then the idea that I am body and world is set in place. And experientially, pleasure is what we are aware of, and pain is what we are aware of. So another deeply ingrained belief gets put in place. My happiness is to be found in outcomes. It's an assumption, a presupposition. And that is very deeply ingrained. And so if we start to see that all of our suffering is based on this ground, and so the content of the suffering is the content of the suffering is based on I am a body in a world, and outcomes are where I will eventually find contentment or happiness or satisfaction. So it means that a belief, a deeply ingrained belief that my happiness is to be found in outcomes, has become ingrained as a belief, has been assumed to be truth, because it's a belief that's ingrained, and therefore thoughts along those lines arise. And our relationship to thinking is that this is true. And so a bit like greyhounds, if you've ever seen a greyhound race, they're in their cages in the start line, and then the rabbit, the decoy rabbit, is sent off its way down the rail. Not a real rabbit, but a fluffy thing on pole that runs ahead of the dogs, and the doors open and the dogs take off chasing after the rabbit. And it's all based on instinct and how they've done it before. And you can see there's no space for the dog to stop and think about what is happening. Is this really what I should be doing? Or is this really what I want? And to an extent, human beings are a bit like that. We have been programmed and we've taken off in a certain direction because there's a certain set of beliefs that keep propelling us into that direction. So I'm describing the deeply ingrained beliefs that are the root of suffering, and we take them to be true. I am the body, physical, exclusively in a world of form. My happiness is to be found in outcomes. And then the next one is, I am the one in control. I am the one that has to do everything. I am the one that has to make everything happen. So in other words, I am a separate, independent, autonomous entity that is responsible for everything that happens through me, or is in control of everything that happens through me. And then we see the other in the same way, and the other is a separate, autonomous entity that has to be in control, or is in control of everything that happens through them. So this is the basis of the teaching. It goes on to say that that ingrained belief then means that we judge ourself and the other. We essentially hate ourself and the other when the other or ourself functions in a way that delivers not pleasure. In other words, delivers pain, because we see that as an attack on who we are, because essentially it's like depriving us, in metaphorically speaking, of oxygen. It's like, if my happiness is to be found in pleasure, 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 every time something happens in life where pleasure is not delivered, that is seen as an attack on my completeness, essentially. It's an attack on my happiness, and happiness, as we feel it, is the most intimate of things. And I say that because really, when you look at it, it's real happiness is peace of mind. And peace of mind means to be at peace, means to be comfortable with things as they are unfolding. That doesn't mean that if you're walking on very sharp rocks that with bare feet, that it's not going to be painful. It doesn't mean that you're not going to feel hot if you're out in the sun. It doesn't mean that it isn't going to be sad if a friend of yours betrays you in some way, or doesn't take you into consideration in a way that you would like. All of these things can continue to happen, and they are pain in life. If we understand that is the nature of life, then the resistance and the layer of blame towards the other falls away. Now, on what basis does the blame fall away? So we can understand that, yes, this is life. Life is going to be sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain. So we can accept it. But when the pain is delivered through another person, we can say, oh, I accept that I'm going to get pain, but I know who delivered the pain, and so I'm going to blame them for it. Well, the problem with that is, one, it will disturb one's peace of mind. Blame is actually an uncomfortableness with the other, which really means an uncomfortableness with oneself. Why is it an uncomfortableness with oneself? Because what the other has done at worst is deliver pain. And that pain, if we believe deep down that our completeness is dependent, creates an uncomfortableness with oneself. Not only because we're blaming them, but because we're feeling as if the other has managed to take part of me away. And so the basis on which we are blamed for the other can stop. It's a feedback loop, actually, that ultimately, if we understand through a connection to ourself, the deep part of ourself that is content already with life as it is right now, if we can rest there, then it becomes very obvious that what the other does is sort of irrelevant, because we will experience pain as pain, pleasure as pleasure, and understand that that doesn't add or subtract from our peace of mind. But until that happens, or it's not only until, the process of that happening is a process of also cutting off the blame that arises while there is still an attachment to outcomes. So attachment to outcomes is the word that is used, or the phrase that is used, to describe our deeply ingrained, misguided belief that my happiness is to be found in outcomes. That is called attachment to outcomes. If that attitude to outcomes changes radically, such that there is no longer a belief that my completeness, my peace of mind, my happiness is to be found in outcomes, we won't suddenly become indifferent to pleasure or pain. We will become indifferent to it as in relation to how it makes me feel about myself. That's what indifference means. It means I'm no longer, my sense of self is no longer determined by what happens in circumstance. But having that disconnect from circumstance doesn't mean that on a biological body level, there won't be a preference for pleasure over pain. In fact, it's not optional. The body will always move towards its preferences. However, if our attachment to outcomes falls away, if the body moves towards a preference and then that preference isn't delivered, the attitude won't be an attitude of blame and expectation and regret. So becoming aware of the deeply ingrained beliefs is very important. What I'm not suggesting that you then have to uproot those beliefs, because how do we do that? We would then need to know how to uproot the beliefs, and that's not really our job. It's not how it works. Simply becoming aware, sometimes it's described as the light of awareness landing on certain dynamics, certain movements. That's how change happens. So if certain beliefs about outcomes and attachment to outcomes is in place, certain beliefs about being the body only are in place, certain beliefs of doership are in place, then thoughts that are uncomfortable thoughts, that are thoughts about circumstance, our attitude to circumstance, they are going to arise. It's not optional. It's just mechanics. So if a mousetrap is one of those old, unfortunate for the mousetraps. If that's set and then something steps on the trigger, then it's mechanics. The arm is going to snap shut. So if the beliefs are in place, if the attachment is in place, when pain is delivered, there is going to be suffering that arises. An awareness of the suffering when it arises, where we can say, oh yes, this is an attitude towards a painful outcome. And I can see that the attitude is an attitude of resistance, not a biological resistance, but a psychological resistance to the fact that my preference hasn't been delivered. A biological resistance would be that if, I don't know, you put your hand on a hot plate, the hand will move away from the hot plate. It's not its preference. And similarly, if someone is throwing stones at you, there will be a biological movement or a biological resistance. You could put up some sort of shield to protect yourself. And someone could say, well, you're resisting the pain. That is the biological resistance because it is part of the circumstance. And so that resistance makes sense. But let's say that the circumstance is over and there is a psychological resistance to this having happened, to having missed an aeroplane, for example. The fact is the aeroplane has been missed, that's it, done. If there is a continuous rumination over the fact that it was, such and such's fault, my fault for not getting to the airport on time, all of that, that's an example of suffering that will often arise as a result of the pain of having missed your aeroplane. We could say financial pain, given that you'll have to probably buy a new airline ticket. There'll be other pains, inconvenience, not maybe going to the event that you were hoping to go to, all sorts of different forms of pain. And as a result, it is very likely that our attitude to the circumstance is one of expectation that it should be different and probably guilt or shame. Now, just because that is described as suffering, which is an uncomfortableness, it is the opposite of peace of mind, doesn't mean it's achievable in any particular moment. Because we're attached to the best, attached to pleasure, we'll say, oh, I want that. Well, you can't have it necessarily. If the ingrained beliefs are in place, then the suffering is going to have to arise. Not optional. So when listening to these talks, be aware of the doership coming in, the attachment to outcomes coming in, that says, okay, this sounds great, I'm going to make it happen. I want it because it sounds good. The first step would be for there to be awareness of the suffering. Even that is not in our control. It happens if, for example, the descriptions I'm putting forward land in a certain way and we don't control how they land. They get processed a certain way and we a change that means awareness of the suffering starts to happen. And so that's not your doing, it's something that is now happening. So I hope you have a sense that the concepts being put forward are a form of new conditioning. And what the new conditioning that life delivers moment after moment after moment, what that conditioning is, we're not in control of. I don't even really know what I'm going to say in the next moment, let alone you being able to control what I say in the next moment. So we can see, oh, the conditioning that life delivers to us, not in my control. But it is delivered, and how it is received and the receiving of it includes it sort of hitting a wall and not being able to penetrate. That's one form, which means it's sort of not received, it's delivered, and it doesn't penetrate. And then there are countless other ways in which it can be received. It could be received and misunderstood. It could be received and understood partially, etc. And it tends to be a process whereby it goes deeper and deeper. And for those people that hear this and it just doesn't resonate, then it's probably destiny that they will not keep listening. And so their destinies for this conditioning not to make a great impact. They might then turn on some other information and be impacted greatly by that. So we don't know what is going to influence us, how it's going to influence us, when what will influence us will be delivered. And so you might start to observe yourself as a biological instrument that is continually being changed or developed. It's continually growing, you could say. And there are two main components of the entity that we are at any point in time. And that is the genetic component. And what I mean by genetic means our blueprint, our physicality as it is, and how the circumstance impacts or interacts with our the hardware, you could say. And so at any point in time, we are a result of our genes and up-to-date conditioning. And we will function according to that design. Not optional. There is no part of our functioning that fits outside of the scope of genes and up-to-date conditioning according to this concept. So the thinking that seems to or feels like it is my doing as the agent, and we say, well, who are we talking about when we say the agent of the thought? And you'll see that the assumption is me, the body object, or the body in the world. And so you might recognize how crudely our thinking has what it's reduced us down to. So it just says the body, without even really going into a clear investigation of what the body is. So if we take the notion further, and movements, it's the muscles and the tendons and the entire body system, and it appears controlled by the brain, including thoughts. So thoughts are actually an output. And somehow our sense of self doesn't see the thought as an output from a machine, but it rather says, I created that. but it doesn't say I, the machine, or I, the brain. It's just a sort of conceptual I that it has come up with and said, that's I am the one, essentially I am. These descriptions might make it easier for things that we have been, where there has been an identification, where our awareness has been lost essentially in the movements of thought, for example. So there's a merging of awareness with the thought, such that the thought is no longer able to be seen for what it is. It's not able to be seen as an object. It is assumed to be the subject. I am the thinking. I am the thinker. If we start to look at thoughts as an output of a biological instrument, then the thought, for the first time, is essentially seen as an object. And if it's an object, we say, well, I can't be that then. And the body is an object. So awareness might then be able to, there can be witnessing of the body-mind organism. Not witnessing doesn't imply there is a witness. It might in some contexts, but in this context, witnessing is one of the bizarre shifts that can happen when it becomes clear to our thinking that so many of the movements and what we have assumed ourselves to be are actually objective, are objects. And I can't be an object. So the question then would be, so who is saying this? And that's where I think a description of the human being is useful, or a description relative to this conversation, to this topic, that the human being is essentially impersonal consciousness of source linked to a particular body-mind organism, in this case, a body-mind organism known as Roger. It has the label Roger, and everyone else has their own name. And each of those body-mind organisms, impersonal consciousness has linked, the same impersonal consciousness has linked to each body-mind organism, and is then functioning through that body-mind organism as what we can say, what we can call personal consciousness. But essentially, personal consciousness is an expression of impersonal consciousness. Not much different to if you were to shine white light through a red filter and then red light comes out of the other end. The red light, the source of the red light is the white light. And the red light is there because the white light has linked or is functioning through the red filter. And so what comes out is red light. And the red light in the metaphor is the personal consciousness, means consciousness functioning through a particular body-mind organism. So from the person's point of view, there is at the core of a person consciousness. And that is something that without consciousness, there would be no awareness of the world, and there would be no sense of self. So the body is moving according to its destiny. And the consciousness can become aware. The consciousness in each of us is capable at any moment, according to its destiny, of becoming aware of the body as an object, becoming aware of emotions as essentially an object arising, first, we could say within the body, but more importantly, within consciousness. Because it is the human being consciousness that is not actually not separate from source, that becomes aware of the thoughts, the emotions, the movements of the body, the speaking, as movements within what it is. And a large part of that shift is dependent on our ingrained beliefs becoming shaken up. Our ingrained beliefs coming under pressure. And one of those beliefs is the I am the body belief. I am my thoughts. My thoughts are absolute. As we start contemplating or thinking about those concepts, and I mean thinking in the form of the working mind, then the reality, the relativeness starts to become apparent. The consciousness that can be aware of the thinking and the body and the sounds has always been here. It's just that it's been hypnotized to be completely identified with the physical and with the thoughts and emotions. So there's no space, essentially. So sounds arise, sight arise. There's the sense of sight, and everything, the movement within the field of vision, the change of sounds within the field of the auditory field. All of that there is awareness of, and if this is why I loved walking. You're just walking, you don't have much to do, and there can just be an awareness of everything that is arising moment after moment after moment. And in that awareness, there can also be a contemplation happening that sees the objects, the sight objects, the sound objects, and is aware that they are always changing, and that there is awareness of what is changing. And what is aware is unchanging. It remains, awareness remains regardless of the changing content. The awareness is there when there is excitement in the body. The awareness is there when there is sadness in the body. The awareness is there when there is suffering in the body. And a shift whereby awareness is more and more aware to the point where it is continually aware. Now, what I mean by aware, I mean someone who hasn't ever listened, anyone is aware because if, a car horn is sounded, they hear it. So there has to be awareness functioning, but I'm talking about awareness of awareness, awareness that awareness is aware. And the more that the seeker becomes aware of the awareness functioning, the awareness, and then becomes aware as part of that, of all of the different objects, including the body object. That is a movement to knowing the aspect of ourself that has always been there but hasn't been recognized, hasn't been realized. It's what we could call the self. The true self. And so anytime that we switch out of awareness of what is happening and go back into what we could call involvement, where obviously there is still a level of awareness of sights and sounds, but no awareness of the fact that there is awareness. And whenever that happens, which usually will happen in an intense situation, when the blame will start, if something is going wrong. So if this awareness is there, then when that happens, there is awareness of that happening. And couple that with the concepts that have become part of the up-to-date conditioning and exist in the working mind, there can be awareness of the suffering, and then the concept can come in and go, there is an attachment to outcomes. Then another part might come in, another part of thinking that says, I shouldn't be attached to outcomes. But then the attachment to outcome continues, and then why am I continually attached to outcomes? And that's then involvement in the involvement. That becomes another layer of shoulds and shouldn'ts, another layer of doership, where we might then get frustrated that I am involved in and blaming, for example. So that's a secondary suffering arising after the primary suffering has arisen. And if that happens, it's destiny. But if our working mind includes the concept that says, the primary suffering is happening because of the deeply ingrained belief in personal doership, and if this witnessing has happened, there is a potential that that might just be witnessed for what it is. And if that's the case, then it means that the belief in personal doership is getting less intense. Because if the belief in personal doership is very intense, then this secondary suffering comes in and says, I should be able to stop blaming the other. And so now we have blame and expectation, or blame and guilt and shame. I'm blaming the other, which is the first layer of suffering, and then I'm blaming myself for not being able to stop blaming. So if the working mind is sufficiently primed with the understanding of what suffering is, and there has been a sufficient amount of recognizing thinking as an object, something that happens as a result of our makeup, there may well be a time when the secondary thinking doesn't come in, and there is just a silent awareness of the fact that blame is happening. Not I am blaming, but blame is happening through a body-mind organism. Now, I'll add this in. Awareness is not thinking. So it might sound like the awareness of the object is a commentary of the object, or awareness of blame might sound like, and it might arise this way at first, which is not really what I'm talking about, and this is why I'm pointing out the difference. It might sound like awareness of blame is a thought about the blame. Oh, look, there I am, I'm blaming. Now that thought is a thought that we could say is of the working mind. It is just an observation, but it's not witnessing. It can lead to, it can be useful, it can complement the witnessing, but the witnessing itself doesn't need the thought commentary that says, oh, there is blame. Just like if there is loud sound, you don't need a thought that says, oh, there is loud sound. There, you can just allow awareness to be aware of the sound. So that is awareness prior to thought, meaning there is awareness of sound, or the awareness of heartbeat, the awareness of the body, without there being a thought that says, I am aware of the body. If you're playing with this, it can be useful to allow the field of awareness to be encompassing of everything at once as much as you can, meaning you can loosen your focus. It doesn't have to. It is more helpful often to allow there to be a loose focus, an open focus, a wide focus that allows the entire circumstance to arise in awareness. In other words, for awareness to be aware of the entire circumstance. That means some peripheral vision, and there doesn't have to be focus or clarity on what is in the peripheral vision. We just know there's something in the peripheral, and there's that which is in front of us, and walls, and our awareness is aware of the entirety of the room. And at some point, it might be, if there is a looseness, enough looseness, that the body object just becomes one object that awareness is aware of. In other words, the body stops being the subject that sees all other objects, and rather it becomes seen more clearly as an object amongst the other objects that are all arising within awareness. If anyone has any questions, you can put your hands up. Hi, Kata.
Hi, Roger. Okay.
How are you?
Yeah, I'm good. It's good to be here. First live. So, what I wanted to ask is about the relationship between awareness of awareness and the resting into being that you say happens when suffering is noticed, and then suffering can fall away, and then there is a resting in being. So, how do those two relate to one another?
Yes. Sorry, just I needed to adjust something, and so I'll repeat your question. That you were talking about witnessing, like witnessing of the suffering, and then a dropping into being where the suffering falls away. Is that right?
Yes.
So the witnessing in a lot of teachings, the end of suffering is not emphasized as the product or the outcome of a process. It's not said enlightenment is the end of suffering. That's what this teaching essentially says. And this teaching says the end of suffering really means peace of mind and daily living in practical terms, right? Because if we don't say that, then end of suffering people throughout history have, because I'm not the first, and Ramesh, my teacher, wasn't the first to say that enlightenment is the end of suffering. Buddhism, the Buddha quite clearly in some places, just that's how he described it. Enlightenment is the end of suffering. In this teaching, there is an emphasis on bringing it down to very practical terms. And so we say the end of suffering is peace of mind and daily living, which means we carry on living our life, doing things, experiencing pleasure and pain as the human being, as the body, but without the added layer of guilt and blame and pride and worry and expectation, which are all of the main forms of suffering. So, as I was saying, other teachings won't even say it's about that. They'll just say it's about awareness, knowing oneself, right? And the self then is referred to as awareness or consciousness. And the whole emphasis of the teaching is to create the shift that in part I was talking about today, a shift that allows there to be a sense, oh, what I am is the formless awareness that is aware of everything that is happening in this moment. And that includes the body, and I am not the body. So it will start off in those teachings as those will be the concepts that the teacher puts forward over and over again, right? You are not the body, you are not your thoughts, you are not the emotions, you are that which is aware of all of those things. And then any reference to I, if a questioner says, but what about how do I do it? Or any reference to oneself as the body is then countered, let's say, by the teaching that says, that is not what you are, all aimed at bringing about a reduction of the habit of self-referencing oneself as the body based on these strong beliefs. To the aim of, and eventually it has an effect, it's very powerful, to bring in the witnessing. And in order for that to be effective, the teaching often will just say, that's it, now that you're witnessing suffering. The notion of the end of suffering is, that's more confusion. You are the witness. And there is a great freedom in that. I don't know if you've experienced the shift between being involved in suffering and the shift to witnessing suffering. The many seekers in those teachings, it's the same in this teaching, that hopefully the witnessing will happen. So anyone who has had that shift will say, that's it, that's the freedom, because there's a great freedom that comes from the in the shift from involvement in suffering to witnessing suffering. The realizing of self, and as the realizing of self happens, then consequences, there are changes to the overall situation, or not situation, but how we experience it. So it starts off as they're just being witnessing, and that's enough. It needs to deepen, and that's why the teachings don't talk about anything else. It's like just remain as the witness. The problem then is that if there is no talk of anything beyond that point, like, well, what you're witnessing is suffering, that is an uncomfortableness with oneself, but there is now a distance from the uncomfortableness with oneself, but a self that is feeling uncomfortable still exists. Now, the seeker in that position will say, no, I am the self, the real self is aware of suffering arising or thoughts arising. The point being is that when we look at the thoughts that are arising, there is a self in those thoughts. There is a conceptual self. I was hurt by the other. I hate them. That's blame, right? That's blame. And so there has been a realization in the system that of a shifting. And when I say realization, not necessarily mental realization, but something has changed where this witnessing has happened. If we don't describe the suffering, then there is just a continuous witnessing of it. And I think the process takes longer because the teaching hasn't, and this isn't a criticism of the teaching, because it's that teaching has probably worked more effectively at bringing the witnessing in by not talking about anything other than witnessing. However, if we talk about the suffering that is arising and talk about the dynamics of it, then what happens when there is a witnessing of that suffering, the working mind will start to see, oh yes, there is a story of blame. And if we can then introduce other concepts that essentially show that to be less rational than we previously thought. For example, the other is just an instrument through which life is functioning, that what happened was not their doing, but rather destiny unfolding. In the same way as the blame can be witnessed, there is a witnessing, it then starts to make sense that everything that is happening in life is an arising, and there is a witnessing of that. So it can then make more sense. Yes, it wasn't their doing. And so the blame doesn't really make sense, because the blame is saying it was their doing. So with the introduction of these other concepts, the witnessing of the suffering then allows the suffering that is being witnessed to be more understood as, let's say, a narrative of seeing the other as a separate entity, from seen from within the belief system or the thinking, and in time, the suffering that is witnessed will become weaker and weaker. And when that suffering that is witnessed gets cut off, then we find ourselves in a place of
So, Roger, I could tell you where you got cut off, which might be where you got cut off for the rest of the people. Would you like that?
yes, thank you.
So, when there is a cutting off of that suffering, then there is a. Does that ring a bell? When the suffering is seen so that it is cut off.
Happens, then meaning a cutting off of, well, meaning it just dissipates, right? There's witnessing, and then the suffering is not there to be witnessed anymore. Then we could say there is a sense of being there. However, it's not necessarily as absolute as that. In witnessing, there is also being. The being and the witnessing are not really two different things. And that's why people will report that the shift from involvement to witnessing is more than enough, or they'll agree, they'll sometimes have the belief that is enlightenment, because there is a rest, there is a sense of self outside of the suffering stream. And so it's not as I don't want to make it sound like witnessing is devoid of being. Witnessing, even if it is witnessing of suffering, is includes beingness in it. But the suffering that is that is in the field of awareness, to some extent, is disturbing. It's not complete peace of mind, because there is still a component in the field of awareness that is essentially the false sense of who I am, the false belief. So witnessing, and as the system gets cleared out more and more, then the suffering that is witnessed gets less and less, and there is a difference, I guess you could say, in a felt difference, because by and large, when the suffering that is witnessed is arising and there is a witnessing of suffering, what the seeker will experience is what we call the flip-flopping, and that is many sort of periods of being in peace and then getting sort of thrown out of peace, where there is involvement and suffering, and then the training, let's say, the rewiring kicks in and witnesses the suffering. But there can be periods where the seeker will go 2 or 3 days or 2 months where the witnessing doesn't kick in, and there is suffering and involvement in suffering. And so that flip-flopping, there's essentially, I guess you could say, three different phases of the flip-flopping, where there is just peace of mind and there's no suffering and everything's great. And that's when, someone might say, oh, it's happened. It's, I can't understand how I used to suffer. It doesn't make any sense to think this way. And that's really when just peace of mind is happening and suffering isn't arising, and it seems like I'm doing it or I'm in control. Then that gets disturbed and we suffering, and there's full involvement in the suffering. Could be where there is this witnessing of the suffering, and eventually the witnessing of suffering, so in the phase when there is witnessing of suffering, there will also be times when there is suffering and no witnessing happening, no freedom, no space from the suffering through witnessing. Eventually, all the vasanas and samskaras, all of the beliefs that the suffering comes out of, get expelled from the system, and then we find the flip-flopping stops, and the witnessing of suffering stops because the suffering isn't there, and that process usually means that there is a quicker cutting off as the understanding goes deeper. There is less periods of time in outside of witnessing where there is just involvement and suffering, and it's essentially just a shift of power from involvement to witnessing. And in complete witnessing, there is no suffering to witness. So hopefully that gives an idea of the transition. The transition has got to do with a lightening of the load of these beliefs, and so as there's less and less, or the beliefs are less and less intense, and then maybe there are fewer of them, fewer attachments that remain, then obviously there's going to be less suffering and more peace of mind, and eventually just peace of mind. Does that make sense, Carter?
Yeah, that was a very comprehensive response. More than I could have asked for. Although I will ask for one more thing, but it's going to be very short. I'd really love to hear what you would say. So if you were to summarize the teaching that you put forth in a word or a sentence or a couple of sentences or a few, like really condensed, of course, leaving some stuff out, I would expect. So this would be more for your audience that is accustomed to the teachings, maybe. What would you say?
The teaching is a teaching about happiness in daily living for the human being. Happiness in daily living, whether we realize it or not, turns out to be peace of mind, not happiness through the acquisition of things or circumstance. Peace of mind really is simply the absence of suffering. Suffering arises in practical terms in the form of guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation. All of those forms of suffering, which are what disturb our peace of mind, are based on a deeply ingrained set of beliefs about who we are and how life works that are misguided. those beliefs, in summary, are the belief that my happiness is to be found in the future when I acquire enough things that I feel are going to be the source of my happiness. And the other misguided belief is I am the doer that is in control of my life and my destiny, and the other is the doer. And so when we see those two beliefs, my happiness is to be found in outcomes, and I am the doer, and the other is the doer, that is the basis on which guilt, so that is hatred, done that have led to my life as it is now. Guilt, blame, the same, hatred or judgment of the other for the actions that have led to pain delivered to me or someone I love. Pride is based on the same doership, but this time in relation to actions that have delivered positive outcomes. And we say, look what I have done. And so the false belief is I am the doer, and the true belief, or the opposite understanding that can sink in, is thy will be done. Life is a happening according to God's will. Life is unfolding, and I am part of the unfolding. If we use the Big Bang as the example, not saying this is absolutely how it is, but it's a good enough example, is that there was nothing, and then there was an explosion of energy, and everything unfolded from there, going from very little space, all very dense, to the expansion, to the point where heat and pressure created gas clouds, and then planets and galaxies and all of that formed. And then as a continuation of that, life on Earth, the atmosphere formed a certain way, and then certain interactions happened. And we are just a movement on that wave. The present moment is the crest of that wave. And so the functioning of everyone can be viewed as the movement of the whole, exactly as it is destined to be happening. And so that's what everything is happening according to God's will, which is very different to the deeply ingrained belief of personal doership that says it's happening because of me, and it's happening because of you. You did this, I hate you. Now with this, everything is happening according to God's will, we understand it was my destiny as part of the unfolding of life for the other person to steal something from me which delivered a certain amount of inconvenience or circumstantial pain. The worry and anxiety and expectation is our attachment to outcome, which basically says, without this, I will die. And so that creates another layer of uncomfortableness with oneself, because life then is very scary. But it's not only about the fact that life is very scary, it's based on the fact that there is a disconnection from our true self, and that disconnection, regardless of even if life was pleasure, 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 instead of what it really is, pleasure and pain, pleasure and pain, even if it was all pleasure, we would still feel uncomfortable if our system has the false belief of who we are ingrained. And so, having pointed out that what we're really looking for is happiness. Happiness is peace of mind. Peace of mind is the end of suffering. And all of this is just happening as part of the unfolding of life. If peace of mind sets in, it's because it was destined for it to set in, not because anyone did it. And the flip side, or the complementary part of the teaching that runs along that more intellectual aspect, is a pointing to that which is the self, that which is beyond or prior to thinking, that which is not physical, that which is unchanging, that which is ever present in this moment, and that which in its essence, without us needing to think about it or justify it, is at peace with itself, in itself, of itself. And that gets revealed as the movements of suffering get minimized, dissolve, and the destiny dissolves the movements of suffering by, as part of the unfolding of life, introducing concepts that become part of our up-to-date conditioning, and that changes the internal structure that used to function. It changes the structure that previously functioned in a way that created suffering, that obscured our peace of mind and our true self. And now the change is one where that suffering doesn't arise.
Thank you so much, Roger. That was perfect. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for asking those pertinent questions. Hi, Tejas. I'm not sure if I'm going in the right order, but that's what's showing up in front of me. How are you?
Oh, yeah, I can go, but I think Terrence was next. However you want to do it.
Okay, I'll go to Terrence after, and then Angie, and then I'll take the opportunity to end the satsang.
Yeah, good to see you again. I just have a quick question. So it seems to me that kind of with the unfolding of this process, like these kind of various stages that happen, I'm going to speak in doership languages just for practical purposes. But like, it seems like the practice is kind of with each step along the way, just come back to source or self or awareness. Would you say that's accurate?
The practice, I mean, to me, that's a great capacity. If that starts, and once again, when I say capacity, I don't mean a personal capacity, but more a movement that we find happening, that at any point in time, if we can come back to self, then there really is nothing wrong. So ultimately, it's about finding oneself resting in self effortlessly without needing to, without a reminder needing to happen. And it doesn't even mean resting in self doesn't necessarily mean the same as when you find yourself dropping into self out of suffering, right? That's we might, because that tends to be quite a overt witnessing, quite a overt movement where we tend to almost be paralyzed in from a body sense, where we just sort of find ourselves sitting often and just being aware without being very functional. And so if I were to say, well, eventually we are continually in that sense of being, then it would make sense that someone would say, oh, one day I'll just be sitting on the couch all day. As you would imagine, Ramana Maharshi to have been in the cave. Whereas this, when we find ourselves in an unbroken state of peace of mind, the beingness, the witnessing is actually quite different to when it's quite different to when suffering is still arising and we find ourselves dropping out of suffering. So that there's much more of a contrast, for starters, between the suffering and the dropping into being, and it's not in the background. Let's say the being becomes much more of in the foreground. It's all you're doing, whereas the end of suffering, I think, is where you could go through your day, 2-3 days, without even thinking about any spirituality. You've got 10 things on your list. You drive to the shops, you do the shopping, you go back home, you then whatever, drive to work, see a client, drive somewhere else, and you're not thinking about being or the self or enlightenment. And it's just that at the end of 3 days, if someone says, so have you suffered in the last 3 days? And you say, no, that's assuming it hasn't arisen, because there is a connection to, you could say, a connection to the self. And that also means simultaneously in your system, the old belief systems aren't there. And so if in the course of that happening, you found sorry, I think I dropped out. So I was saying that if you had these 3 days, you're going to meetings and whatever, if you found yourself going to a meeting one day and you had a flat battery, it was an important meeting and you couldn't get to the meeting, the sort of the panic might have happened when there was a previous attachment to outcomes wouldn't happen. You might still feel stressed about the situation, but it wouldn't cascade into this sense that this is an attack on my completeness, my beingness, and blaming oneself for not having turned off the lights, car lights or whatever. That just wouldn't happen, because it's no longer part of the functioning of that system. But I hope you get the impression it doesn't mean you're going to be a particularly, spiritual person in the way of walking down the street with a halo around you and being able to do magical things. And so to me, the end of suffering is you get to be Tejas, just without the old hassle that used to happen in terms of feeling uncomfortable with yourself. I forgot what the question was that I was answering.
No, that was great. Yeah, you answered it. The question was, it seems like with the process of this unfolding, like it seems like the main practice is coming back to self or awareness or source. And then you answered it. And yeah, I mean, yeah, I would say that there's, with this kind of phase I'm at, it's more just like yeah, like coming back to source again. There's no one doing it, but if I happen to get caught in a thought loop, but even that's dropping away. It's continuing to drop away. It seems like there's just like new habit being trained. But yeah, I don't even, with all this spiritual stuff, I mean, I've definitely, I'm not even sure I could say I'm spiritual anymore, or not as spiritual, because I don't know, I had all these ideas of you have to become like a Buddhist monk on top of a mountain or something and have a staff, but that's just a whole bunch of nonsense, it seems like.
Yeah, well, you see, the dropping into being, which is why I was sort of trying to contrast the two, that when there's continuous unbroken peace of mind, it doesn't actually mean a state of continuous being in the same way that happens when we're flip-flopping or when suffering is still arising. So that dropping into being really is where we become more and more familiar with the self that isn't affected by circumstance, and become familiar with the fact that peace is available even when things are going wrong, because you can drop out of a circumstance at any time into being and be like it just when when you've dropped out of thinking into being, there just isn't a problem. So the system starts to essentially get first-hand experience of what is being spoken of, and then that aids the process of undermining the deeply ingrained belief systems that say, for example, my happiness is to be found in everyone being perfect, in government understanding everything and becoming perfect government. And so that dropping into being is essentially, to me, just a part of the dissolution process. And when the beliefs have been dissolved, the beingness is not particularly necessary. Where it then kicks in and is still something that we find ourselves or find happening is when there's nothing to do, for example, where you don't have a project or a task, then you can just find yourself dropping into being while you're sitting waiting for the bus or walking. And it's sort of, you realize, oh, it's not even about being. It's being is a lovely thing that I guess allows us to experience the depth of ourself, but it's not even in peace of mind. What's really important is that the suffering dynamic has dissolved and stops arising. And then we find ourselves resting in being occasionally when there's not much that needs to be done, or in situations that are painful, because I think being able to drop into a more meditative state when there is pain, emotional pain or physical pain, makes it more bearable. Yeah, so that's what I have to say.
Thanks so much, Roger. That was great. Yeah.
You're welcome. Pleasure.
Hi, Roger.
Hello, Terence. Good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you again. Actually, my question is pretty similar to the previous two, like when you were talking about dropping into being and witnessing. I guess I was curious about, I guess, the stages or the stages of different shifts that could happen. So it feels like when you try to drop into being, or basically pulling your attention away from thoughts, you can kind of get a sense of how the body's functioning automatically. Like when you were talking earlier about taking a walk, if your attention is not in thought, you can kind of see how the body's just walking mechanically and doing it without you having to be the one to do it. But I guess with when there are thoughts, are you still there, Roger? You're frozen right now.
Okay. Yeah, I'm back again. But yeah, when you're talking about walking, and you can.
Yeah, and you can get a sense that the body's functioning automatically, and you actually no longer really have a sense of agency over the body, or you don't feel like the doer. But once thought comes in, you sort of feel like the doer again. And yeah, I was wondering about how you, like you talked about before how you had two shifts, and I was wondering if in that deep witnessing phase, do you have no sense of agency, and then later in a more integrated phase, you can have a sense of agency or a feeling of doership return. And I'm kind of referencing I watched one of your old satsangs where you talked about the concepts of the feeling of free will and the concept of as if. So did you go through a period where you didn't lost sense of agency, and then later with a second shift, a feeling of doership comes back, but with a deep knowing that you're not really doing it, it just feels like it? Was that kind of your experience, and is that the typical experience
Yeah.
that
So
people?
yeah, it's a good point. What happens is that we get concepts given to us. Am I frozen or
No,
no?
you're still there.
It's still good. We get concepts that we're not the doer. Everything is that we have no free will, right? That everything is just happening, and those concepts are very useful at bringing about a shift into witnessing, where that is felt, like from the witnessing point of view. And I'm not saying that the body or the person witnesses, right? It's a shift sort of to almost like an out of body experience. And from that point of view, as I imagine you've got a sense, the body is just an object moving, and there's no sense that that is what I am. And if there is a sense of somehow that is still me, the body, in the witnessing, it, from that witnessing point of view, the body is just, as you said, just moving according to, and it feels like according to, well, let's call it God's will, because from the witnessing point of view, it's like, well, I'm not the one doing it, I'm the one aware of it, and maybe even the sense where it's not separate from me, but there isn't a sense I am creating it, right? There might be a belief in some, because some teachings might give you the belief you create everything that happens. That would just be a belief. In the witnessing, there is an awareness of what is happening, even a sense that I'm not separate from it, that it is made of what I am as formless awareness, but no sense that I am in control of what comes next. So in that phase, someone might say, if I were to say, but there is free will in the moment for you to do whatever you feel like. Now that concept, and I know because that's what Ramesh said to me, when I was in the witnessing state, that made no sense to me. All that really, from my experience, made sense was I am the witness and the body is just moving, and it is moving according to, well, it wasn't an agent, it was just part of everything that was happening. What we tend to miss as seekers is that we're not in the witnessing state all of the time. And so when we sort of find ourselves more back in the body, which is, as far as I put it forward, after the process takes us to witnessing, it then brings us back into the body. The witnessing phase is there because it's very good at showing us life from a different perspective, where a lot of our deeply ingrained beliefs can then be challenged based on our own experience. And I think that's the benefit of witnessing and why it happens. It creates space, it creates a sense of how life can be lived very different to what we've experienced, or how life can be felt very different to our experience. But it means that we know ourselves solely as formless awareness. There's no sense of being the body. Well, the truth is there is, because we tend to have states of witnessing intermittent, and so at some point when you get up from your meditation, you might walk to the fridge and still be in a meditative state, but at some point you'll be going around the house sort of back to normal again. And so when we're describing our understanding, we tend to describe it only from the intense witnessing position. And so if someone were to say, but you do have free will, then you go to your experience, free will, the question of free will or whatever, it just doesn't make sense, and it doesn't have a place. So then that's where, if we're going to talk about free will in the context of the enlightened position or liberated position or end of suffering position, we need to embrace or include the understanding that enlightened living doesn't mean living in a state of unbroken witnessing, where one feels one is formless awareness and has sort of not much to do with the body. Integration, which is a phase after witnessing, is coming back into the body and saying, well, actually, I have to live life as Roger. And then when that is embraced and it is realized that that's the point, not to live as formless awareness, then we might realize, oh, I may actually have found myself bypassing a little bit. So witnessing can be very useful. It shows a lot, but there's also the risk that we end up, because we believe that is what enlightenment is, so we keep going back there, waiting for it to become continuous, unbroken, and remain like that forever. Then we might be lucky to hear something maybe like this particular explanation that says, you're not meant to live life as formless awareness. It's very important to come in contact with formless awareness and become very familiar with formless awareness, but then it needs to be integrated back into the body. In the natural development, consciousness.
You cut out for like 20 or 30 seconds, right? Just now.
Oh, did I? Okay.
Yeah.
What was the last thing you heard?
I'm not sure, but it was just like 20 or 30 seconds, maybe.
Yeah.
The last thing that you said.
Yeah. So, someone might realize that, or might hear this, that you're not really the point. Oops. Yeah, that well, I don't know where I was really, but that the point, the point is not to be out living as formless awareness. So at some point we come back into the body, the process brings us back into the body, and we find that we can be in the body, and suffering might arise, and so we go back out into witnessing, and eventually we can come back into the body, and the last bit of the process where there's still suffering, but it starts to get managed from a different perspective rather than just going into witnessing. And then there's a living as Roger. And that's where it starts, the notion of free will, even with the understanding I'm not the doer, that everything's happening. Life is a paradox. A lot of things are paradoxical, which really means it's not black or white. We need to be able to understand things in an integrated way. And so, although everything that is happening can be said to be a happening, thinking is a happening, what we choose when we open the fridge is a happening according to our preferences that we don't put in place, and the thoughts that happen, and what is seen, and what we feel like eating. And so we could say, if orange juice is brought out of the fridge, it was destiny and you're not the doer. Essentially, everything is happening according to God's will. So then we'd say, oh, well, so that means I have no will. If everything is God's will, how can I have any free will? It seems like there's no space for free will in that context. But what if we say, okay, but God's will and your will, and what do I mean by your will? Like the thought of what you would like. So God's will and your will are not two things. God's will happens through you. So God's will in practice arise as, oh, I would like orange juice. So I would like orange juice is God's will, but it's also my will in practice. So in practice, we say I have complete free will in the moment to do whatever I like, which is really a description that says when I open the fridge, in practice, what happens is there's a looking at what's in the fridge, and there could be a feeling of hunger, and it could be a hunger for savory or for sweet or whatever. And I look in the fridge and then I go, oh, I'd like a cookie. And I feel like I am in control of taking the cookie and having the cookie. And similarly, if there was a cookie or a salad and I could look at the two, and technically you go, well, in practice, are you not free to go cookie, no, salad, no, cookie, salad? And you go, I'm completely free to choose whichever I like. And so the theoretical and the practical need to be seen as two sides of a coin. Okay, I know where I dropped off then, because I saw you freeze, Terence. So the paradox, the practical and the theoretical, because the theoretical has made such an impact on us, right? When we're going into the witnessing, it is all about how everything is happening. It's God's will, and that can take over a little bit, so that it brings about the witnessing. Hi, Terence.
Hi,
I'll sort of try and bring the question or the answer to an end, and then bring the
Okay.
satsang to an end, because the internet just keeps dropping out.
Sure.
So I think we just need to realize that from a practical point of view, we are free. That we, let's say, the thoughts that, oh, I would like orange juice, line up with what the body sensations are. And that from a practical point of view, we don't feel, when we come back into the body, we don't feel like we are a slave that is being dragged along by the next slave, the slave in front that we're handcuffed to or strapped to or whatever, or that as soon as we pick the salad, we get, whipped or something. So even though from the one hand, we're functioning according to our genes and up-to-date conditioning, everything is God's will, from the practical point of view, which means, okay, put that aside, where you don't have to believe that to be, oh goodness,
You're still there.
still there, good. Then we can acknowledge, oh, and I have free will. So then it means that our brain has to be able to hold two concepts that seem to be contradictory, but when our brain can hold those two concepts and see that they're complementary, not contradictory, that the feeling, so then that's why I've described it before, we have the feeling of free will. But in other words, we can live as if we are free. But when something happens and it delivers an outcome, we also need to know I'm free, but at the same time, everything I do is completely dictated by genes and up-to-date conditioning that I had no control over. And so I'm free and I'm not free. But I get to live my life as if I'm free. And I don't think that life would be at all what it is if that feeling of free will was taken away, and someone would go, oh, it's just a feeling, because of this other concept, you are doing everything according to your genes and up-to-date conditioning. But in a way, that's who I am. I'm also the body, because I'm a person, which is impersonal consciousness source linked to a particular body-mind organism called Roger. And so I know myself as Roger in its entirety, the body, mind, and the consciousness. And so the brain, which is relative, essentially is who I am. So the fact that the conscious part of me is not in control doesn't mean it's not my freedom, because it's essentially in line with my thoughts. The taking the cookies out of the fridge is in line with my thoughts. I'm not being dictated by someone else's thinking. So from another point of view, we'll have to say, oh, I have free will because my actions are aligned with my thoughts. That's the standard position, right? If you listen to a lot of scientists, they'll say you don't have free will, because they'll agree with this notion that the brain is functioning because of everything that comes before. It's a chain of causality. And so from one perspective, science will say you have no free will. But those concepts are not absolute concepts. They're relative concepts from a certain point of view. From another point of view, I go, yes, my machinery is relative and follows laws of mechanics, but it's who I am. And so my actions are my actions. The bigger question, so I would say that we have to hold both. The I'm not the doer is what cuts off the attitude of suffering, and I have free will is what we have in the circumstance. So that, and we say that God's will, God functions through each of us. So God's will and my will are not two. They're two sides of one coin. Having said all this, what we definitely don't have, whether we have free will or not, is we don't get absolved of responsibility. We will still get punished by society for actions that are not in line with social norms. And so the acceptance of my genes and up-to-date conditioning dictating everything doesn't mean that I'm, I can suddenly get away with everything. So a lot of people have problem with the notion of non-doership because they say, oh, well, that means that, oh, you're just using it as an excuse. I'm saying, well, it's not a very good excuse because I'll still get put in prison for anything I do wrong. What it is a recognition that means my attitude doesn't lead, my attitude to circumstance, which includes my attitude to my actions and my attitude to the other's actions, doesn't lead to suffering. But I also know that there will be consequences, and the consequences will be seen as part of destiny. But in short, we don't get absolved of responsibility just because we see that life is less personal than we might previously have imagined it to be. So on that note, sorry, Angie, I know you've had your hand up and I know that I would come to you, but I'm sure if I did, the internet will drop out 3 or 4 times. But please, if you put your hand up in the next satsang, if you happen to be here and the question persists, I'll try and remember and come to you first. Thanks for understanding. Thank you, everybody. Have a good day. Peace.